Thank you to Red Eye, the Photography Network, for partnering with us to produce Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. Red Eye is a not-for-profit organization with a strong ethical focus, offering support and opportunities to help you advance your photography and your career. Find out more at redeye.org.uk. Welcome to Season 3 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 1, we'll be talking with Ryan Christopher Jones about positionality and power. Ryan Christopher Jones is a Mexican-American photojournalist whose work explores migration, labor, agriculture, and the environment across the United States and Mexico. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times, and his stories have been seen in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Intercept, CNN, BuzzFeed, and more. He's the 2022 recipient of the American Mosaic Journalism Prize, which is awarded to 2 freelance journalists each year for outstanding long-form reporting of underrepresented communities in the U.S. In fall 2022, Ryan will begin a PhD program in social anthropology, where he will continue to study the ways that water scarcity and environmental concerns are affecting Mexican-American communities. Thanks very much for joining me on the podcast today. I was wondering, could we start with you just telling us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, my work has evolved over the years, but recently it's gone in the route of identifying how Mexican-American communities across the United States are kind of responding to their environment. Over the last handful of years, I've worked on stories on labor and migration, both in California's Central Valley, which is where I'm originally from, and New York, and I was at the border. I've worked in Mexico. Most of my work has focused on the Mexican-American experience as a way to understand myself.
That's brilliant. And that's, I think, such an interesting theme that's coming out a lot, especially in the past couple of years, is people sort of maybe focusing on topics and areas that are quite personal and that help others understand the world around them, but also help us understand ourselves. I think that that's a really lovely way to approach your work.
Yeah, I feel lucky that journalism and photography and documentary photography can be a vessel to ask questions of the world, but also ask questions of the things that are important to you kind of personally and specifically. I don't want to make the work about me because it's not, but my curiosities come from the things that affect me, and then figuring out how to, tell stories and be curious in the world that I'm a part of. I think that's a huge part of what journalists do, is bridging that gap between personal curiosities and the greater concern for global issues.
And has that always sort of been your primary focus as a photojournalist, or sort of what led you to focusing specifically on the Mexican-American experience?
I've been a photographer for about 20 years. I was a commercial photographer. I was a wedding photographer. But I was always curious in other people, quote unquote, other cultures. And I moved to New York about 10 years ago to become a journalist, but I didn't know what kind of journalist that I wanted to be. When I moved to New York, I didn't know what topic, what issue, what kind of my vision for journalism was going to be. And then I took a Mary Ellen Mark workshop before she passed. And I was already kind of floating with the idea of documenting a Mexican-American community in New York City. But I'm half white, I'm half Mexican, and I go to Sunset Park in 2014 to say, okay, this is my story. And I get to Sunset Park and I realize, I don't really speak Spanish. How am I going to do this? And this is part of, being a second generation, descendant of Mexican immigrants. Spanish actually wasn't taught in my home. Assimilation was more important than immersing our family in Spanish language. So I didn't know Spanish as well as I should have. And once I got to Sunset Park, I realized, oh, what actually am I doing here? What is my voice? What is my vision? Why am I the person to tell this story? That's crazy. So I took a step back. I took this Mary Ellen Mark class and I asked her about it. I said, I have these kind of crazy tensions about who I am as an American, as a half Mexican, half white guy. I'm brown, but I don't really speak Spanish. And so the world sees me different than how I see myself. But I'm curious in understanding, Mexican American communities. And she just simply said, go, do it. Like the only way that you can really understand but the things that you're curious about is to kind of put yourself in the scenes and feel it out. And I went to Mexico a couple years later and started asking bigger questions about kind of my relationship to Mexico and what it meant politically, what it meant personally, what it meant for my own family's history. And so that's been the general lens that I've approached my work, and it's gone in many different tangents. And so I'm thankful to have this vehicle to ask questions of the world, but to do it with a sense of grace and with a sense of I'm still learning here and I'm not the one that has all the answers.
Absolutely. I think it's so been a theme of the podcast. You know, people talking about having that vulnerability, I think, to say, yeah, there are gaps and I'm filling them. And that's, I guess, the only way, I think it's really interesting what you're describing because I think your experience really challenges that idea of a binary insider-outsider dynamic. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I ended up taking a class a few years ago. It was a cultural history of Mexico. I started to work a lot more at the border. I was working on more Mexican-American stories in New York City. And I wanted to get a broader theoretical framework and historical framework for what are the power relations between the United States and Mexico that have existed before I came onto the scene and started asking my silly questions. What has existed there? So I took this class. It was through Harvard Extension School. It was called Moctezuma's Mexico. And it was a bridge between the Mexico of the past and the Mexico of the present. So it talked about, Aztec Empire, the Spanish conquest, and kind of this mestizaje, like the mixed relationship of kind of modern Mexico. And David Carrasco, he's the professor, and he had a lecture about exactly this, about kind of personal identity and the way to frame that against the backdrop of a much longer history. And he also had struggled with having this multicultural identity because he also was both white and Mexican. And growing up, I always felt that I was too white to be fully Mexican and I was too Mexican to be fully white. So I felt that I was not enough of either camp. And he had this amazing point. He said, you actually have the capability of speaking from two centers now. So you can be a Mexican when you need to, and you can look at the white experience as an outsider. And then you can look from your white experience at the Mexican experience. And so you can be both an outsider and an insider at the same time. That really fundamentally changed the way that I thought about insider and outsider. And as someone whose family is both from Mexico and Missouri and Spain, I have a lot of inside and outside relationship that I bring to these curiosities. So that very much changed the way that I think about storytelling and what is actually considered an outsider. And like you said, it's not really this easy binary that's easily reducible to, only English people live in England. There are 1,000 reasons why that is such a complicated statement, but, you have to factor in, migration and history and refugees and forced assimilation. And those are all things that need to be factored into complicating this binary.
And when you're talking about, speaking from two different centers or multiple centers, as it were, how does that actually come out in your photographs? Like, how does that reflect in the sort of visual stories that you're telling?
Okay, so for example, in 2019, I followed a man. He was a Mexican man who lived in New York City, but he's originally from Puebla, Mexico. And part of the story was identifying the sacrifices that immigrants have to take and immigrants have to make in order to work in the United States. So he worked in a Mexican restaurant in Queens. And, part of the allure of the American dream, or the idea, the fallacy of the American dream, is that the places that these people are coming from are worse than the United States in any number of reasons. But this story that I worked on, I followed him back to Mexico, and I was blown away by how much ostensibly more complicated things were in New York than in Mexico. In New York, he lived in a crowded, underground, illegal basement with like 6 or 7 other people. And he had no space. He shared a room. He had a very, very tiny window. He had no real intimacy with other human beings. I followed him back to Mexico, and his family owns multiple houses and buildings and crops of corn, and they have little tiendas on the street. And it confronted the way that I think a lot of people think of Mexico, number one, and what people leave from these countries to come back, to come and to work in the United States. So ostensibly, his life was far more intimate and interesting in Mexico, but he just simply couldn't make enough money on these corn crops. And so he had to move to New York City 20 years ago, and he's been in New York ever since. And so I think that coming from a place where both Mexico and the United States, it's a known reality for me, I approached that story with a bit more of a nuance to push out the idea that, like, okay, well, America is clearly the utopia here. And clearly Mexico is the place that needs to be escaped. And so that experience was manifested in these pictures pretty clearly, where his experience in New York was incredibly claustrophobic. It was almost entirely indoors. And once I got to Mexico, I had to use a wider lens because the expanse was much, much more intense. And the landscape was just much more complicated than just him living in the small apartment in New York City. So coming from these two centers and being able to understand that Mexico is different than how it's often framed in the media, and the United States in this experience was different than how it's usually framed in the media, I think it allowed me to change the visual language of how I felt this story should be seen and interpreted by an audience.
I wonder as well, I guess, when you said that you sort of threw yourself into exploring this through your work in photography, this dynamic in terms of where you fit in, and like you said, who are you to tell this story and what story should you tell? I can imagine that through this whole process, you probably encountered some quite interesting ethical dilemmas. Are there any that you'd like to share or relate?
The first one was a really broad dilemma, which is, what is the actual story here? The original idea was, in these underground apartments, there are just a ton of strangers living together, and they're kind of living on top of each other. And this, so much so that the slug, it's like the small phrase that the New York Times says, here's what the story is about. It was crowded house. So we went into it with the expectation that this house was going to be just kind of teeming with people all the time. I go for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, very early on in the reporting. And I go, and Amado, the man that I followed, he was the only one there. And I go the second time, he was the only one there. His roommate was working. His other roommates were in their room, and they didn't interact at all. So it wasn't exactly how anyone imagined this story would be visualized. So much so that I wasn't getting what I needed or what I wanted from the story. But I was talking to Amado. He said that he was going back to Mexico. I talked to my editor, Jeff Ferticella. He was the Metro editor of the New York Times. And he's like, all right, well, these pictures aren't really doing anything. So maybe let's get you out to Mexico to see the other part of the story. Maybe you can contextualize where the story is kind of ultimately coming from. I go to Mexico. I see that, his life is ostensibly better in many ways other than the finances. And it forces me to have this conversation with both Jeff, and the reporter saying, this is not a crowded house story. The idea that the housing market is so exploitative that all these people are like living on top of each other, which they are, but it didn't manifest visually. And so we had to have a big kind of broader, like ideological reframing of the story of this story is not about really housing. This story is about sacrifice. And making a pivot like that, I think, is a huge ethical consideration, because continuing on with the story that like, oh, these seven guys, they're living in this tiny apartment, and then trying to manufacture in whatever visual way possible to show the idea that this house is crowded could have been done with enough time, but it wasn't true to the actual story. And so only until after I came back from Mexico and had these conversations with the reporter, Nikita Stewart, and Jeff, my editor, and said, guys, we're actually telling the wrong angle of this story. This is not a crowded house story. This is what this man is willing to compromise in order to support his family. And so, like I said, it's a broad kind of ethical framework of where do we take this story? And of course, there was a ton of other specific instances in that story. But I think that the bigger, more ideological one is pretty telling.
I think that's such an interesting example. And I really appreciate your sharing that with us, because I think maybe another layer to this I'd like to know more about is in those instances when you do have to pivot a story, when you find that maybe what you expected to find isn't actually what's there, I can imagine it can be a very difficult conversation to have with editors. And I wonder, how do you navigate those conversations, and what do you do if someone isn't willing to pivot or to make that change?
Well, luckily, my editor, Jeff Verticella, he is unbelievably thoughtful and receptive. And he actually listens to the photographers out in the field, because they're the ones out in the field. They're the ones seeing this stuff. And so when I came back from Mexico, I put together a big gallery of the work. And it was night and day between what I was photographing in New York versus what I was photographing in Mexico. And so the proof was in the visuals. The proof was in what I saw and what I brought back. So it actually wasn't that tough. In this case, it wasn't that tough to pivot, because I was lucky enough to collaborate with an editor who actually listens to people. And that's not necessarily like the case all the time. But for these bigger stories where it's a lot of time, it's a huge investment, and it's a real kind of emotional arc. Yeah, luckily I have editors like Jeff and other editors who really listen.
That's great. No, that's always good to hear.
It is. Yeah, it's reassuring, to be honest.
Absolutely. And it makes me think as well a little bit about the opinion piece that you wrote in the New York Times about the way that the opioid crisis in America has been represented. And I guess I was just thinking, if we're talking about telling the wrong story or needing to pivot the story, I think you talk a lot about that in that piece and how, stories are being told. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It also stemmed from reporting that I did in the Bronx for the Metro section for the Times. And when I was first assigned that story, which was also through Jeff, by the way, that's like why we've been able to get to this place after, a couple years of us trusting each other. I can go to Mexico and come back and say, by the way, we've got the story all wrong. and he listens to me, because we went through the whole, Bronx overdose story and that arc together, and we both learned a lot. So yeah, when I was first assigned that story in the end of 2017, it was the first time that I had photographed, addiction. And I was like, okay, I just want to see what kind of visual body of work exists out there. So, it's very easy to do a Google search of drugs or addiction or, the crack epidemic, which was the last big kind of drug epidemic in the United States. And those Google searches, like the contact sheet of those Google searches are horrifying. They're all photographed pretty similarly. They are, I mean, as I mentioned in the op-ed, kind of in the single dimension of pain. And it shows that these people are visualized that they can do almost nothing but exist in this space of suffering. So I looked at that and I was like, oh gosh, I don't want to do that. And I talked with the reporter, Jose Del Real, talked with Jeff, and we had this conversation saying, like, I don't want to make those pictures. Even if we're confronted with a scene where people are, shooting heroin, I don't want to do that. So I did. So Jeff, he trusted me, and it was a lot harder. It's actually pretty easy to photograph someone, jamming a needle into their body if they're at an incredibly low point in their life. From how it's been communicated to me, it's like, well, yeah, sure, photographing, whatever, like nothing matters. And it's really easy to photograph those scenes. It's much, much more difficult to identify, well, where is the humanity here? Like, where are the scenes that kind of transcend suffering and into a point of connection? And so the photo that ended up being the most impactful one, I was photographing two women who shot heroin. I was there for the scene. I watched it all. And after one woman had injected, she had a breakdown. She just had a breakdown. She said, what am I doing with my life? And I'm, keeping my distance. And then her friend went and embraced her. And it was this moment of connection. It was this moment of humanity amidst this incredible suffering. And so I took those photos, and it ended up being, a way to visualize how two people can connect as humans in the middle of otherwise horrific scenes. So that ended up being the photo that was used. I'm still proud of that scene. And I'm proud that, again, I was able to have the conversation with Jeff and say, here's why this photo is more important than a photo of, one of those women jamming a needle into their arms or necks or whatever. Like, we don't need to see another one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many things to unpack in what you just said. I think the first thing is that I can imagine, you're saying it's quite easy to take a photograph of sort of the quite graphic horrors of the opioid crisis, but it's harder to get the more nuanced, more sensitive, more delicate sides of it. And I guess that probably takes quite a lot more time. Is that sort of the main ingredient, or are there other ingredients to that sort of recipe?
Well, yeah, because it's not necessarily just time, but with time comes trust, and from trust comes intimacy. And so I don't think that I would have been able to get that photo of those two women embracing had I not spent enough time with at least one of them, Kelly, for the weeks before that, to show that, like, here, this is what I'm trying to do. We had a very explicit conversation about, here are the photos that I'm trying to make, and here are the photos that I'm not trying to make. And she respected that. So yeah, time is I think the initial catalyst for how both trust and intimacy can be introduced into these scenes. And yeah, I think that story we reported for maybe 3 weeks, which was not a long time at all, but it was enough to build a rapport.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you mentioned, you described how at the start of the project, you did a Google image search. And that's something that I'm always encouraging photographers to do, to see what the gaps are, to see, how is something being reported and how can we counteract that? Because if we don't know what's been overdone, we're at risk of replicating those stereotypes and tropes. Are there any other things like that you do to prepare before you go on an assignment?
Yeah, I generally research the body of visual work that exists on, the particular theme or issue or story that I'm working on. And I also, as someone who's going to school for anthropology, I also look at academic research. I'm really curious to see what other fields, how they're looking at these themes and what language they're using to talk about it, which is really important because it's very easy for journalists to get really myopic and to get really narrow about their focus and only looking at journalists and only looking at journalism that's been produced and these journalists, these photographers, these whatever. My work has actually benefited greatly from infusing academic research and understanding. Again, it's mostly about what's the language that other professions and other fields are using about this thing that I care about. And oftentimes that will help inform the way that I approach scenes as well.
Have you ever had a moment, I guess, maybe more generally thinking back through your career as a photographer, have you ever had a moment that was sort of the moment that made you start thinking about these things differently, or that made you really stop and question your work? I mean, I know you spoke about the moment in Sunset Park. Yeah, I'm wondering if there are any other maybe moments that, because you're somebody who is thinking quite a lot about these questions of ethics and representation.
I mean, I still have to go back to, the instance that I was just talking about with the overdose story in the Bronx. That photo, ran front page of the New York Times. And I was very immediately confronted with the idea that our work does not live in this bubble where if you make it, it's like, who's really going to see it? And I mean, of course, I'm lucky enough to work for a place like the New York Times that has the visibility that it does, but that also comes with an unbelievable responsibility. And so I was actually shocked at realizing myself the reach that photography has, and that, people, I think, are still learning visual literacy. One of my big things is like, how can we teach people to read and understand pictures more thoughtfully? Because pictures are ubiquitous now. But yeah, having a front page of the New York Times for a picture that is ostensibly of someone suffering, it constantly helps me reinforce the idea that like every single picture that I make could be seen like this. It could be put out there. And, the idea of do no harm is inherent to, it's inherent to journalism. Whether or not that's been practiced is another issue. But yeah, there's a big responsibility in understanding, like, is this picture going to bring more harm to the person who has been photographed? And then again, what's the dynamic of power between me, the person who's getting paid to make this photo, and you, the person who receives no monetary benefit from it, to receive no monetary benefit of your suffering?
Absolutely. Like, I really appreciate everything that you just said there. And one thing in particular, you were talking about the difference in maybe the public's understanding or the public reaction or public discourse to a photograph of someone injecting versus someone embracing. And I think that that's such an important thing, because all of the photographs that we consume totally impact how we think about the world. And they sort of get stored, another data point in our head about other people that we maybe don't encounter on a regular basis. So that power, I think, cannot be overstated. And I love hearing other people talk about that as well. I did see recently that you posted to Twitter about some ethical concerns you had about the way that people are represented in some NFT photography. And I'm also aware that you have been selling NFTs of your work yourself. And so I was wondering maybe if you could unpack that a little bit or talk a little bit about maybe some of those concerns you raised.
It's hard to make a living in editorial work. And that means that a lot of photographers are, I don't want to say desperate, but a lot of photographers are eager to find new ways to monetize their work. NFTs and crypto comes along, and it's like, oh, well, here's something that we can experiment with. And so that's how I am approaching it. But I think that once you start asking these bigger questions of, these people are making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on sometimes terrible photos, exploitative photos, photos that are just kind of reductive and predictable. And so I think that the idea of ethics need to be introduced into this space. And the NFT photo community really just likes talking about how great it is to have a community. And that's fine. But people aren't really talking about like the bigger issues of like what happens when you make that kind of money on someone's face. And that person had no say in its production, in its kind of reselling. So I have no idea what's going on in that world. I have no idea how it's evolving. I have gotten so skeptical of it that I've actually taken the link down from like my link tree, just because I don't know if this is something I really want to participate in yet until I wrestle with these bigger questions. And then there's a huge question of the NFT photo community. They're talking about work can be made for the blockchain. Work can be made to exist in this kind of nebulous crypto space. But I don't know, is that the audience that I want? Is that the audience that I want to be kind of consuming my pictures and these stories that I'm investing my time in? So I don't know. I'm approaching the whole thing very skeptically, and I ultimately don't know if I'm going to continue or how I'm going to put work out there or if I'm going to put work out there. But as it stands, I'm pretty uncomfortable with all of it, which is why I put that Twitter conversation up there, because it's like, hey, y'all aren't talking about this stuff. Why? And it's ultimately because, we're all kind of desperate to make some money.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that financial insecurity angle of photography is a massive one. And it's also an ethical issue itself, that photographers are undersupported a lot of times, especially freelance photographers in the industry. So you can sort of see how all these ethical issues, I think, are quite compounding and feed into each other. I saw on your website as well that you have done some reporting on the COVID pandemic. And I can imagine that there are ethical questions as well that you've encountered with that, or just complications of, working during a pandemic. And I was wondering if you could share something about that with us as well.
Oh, yeah. The pandemic put a lot of photographers in a precarious place because we weren't trained to be conflict photographers. We weren't trained to be pandemic journalists. And so in the early stages of the pandemic, there was this general sense of confusion between freelancers and publications of like, what's right here? Because like we were the ones who actually had to be in the scenes. So we were the ones who were on like the front lines of the pandemic. There was some kind of initial bigger questions of like, what does it mean to report on this thing that no one really knows, the safety or the health ramifications? But yeah, there were some publications who were like, we're going to send you masks and gloves and Tyvek suits and all this stuff to make sure that you're taken care of. And there's other publications that said, oh yeah, sorry, we can't send you a mask. But oh yeah, can you go into Elmhurst Hospital, which is where everyone was dying? No. Why would I do that? So I do think that this is an interesting opportunity to talk about like ethics is not just a localized thing that happens by the people in the field, by the photographers, by the journalists. And that is often put on us because we are the ones in the field. But what's the greater ethics of kind of story production across publications, about relationships with editors who perhaps aren't doing their jobs, with publications who are acting unethically when it comes to putting their freelancers in harm's way without hazard pay, without any PPE, without any kind of pre-knowledge of what these people are getting themselves into. So yeah, ethics is a localized thing, but it's also a much more institutionalized thing that I think needs to be talked about too. And there was a breakdown of ethical story production throughout the pandemic. And it happened both from photographers, editors, and institutions.
I know that some photographers were maybe in a position that they were the one who could be with somebody who was ill, and quite severely ill due to COVID, when the family members couldn't. And I wonder, it seems like that might have been the situation that you were in the photo story that I saw on your website. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, that's easily the most kind of strenuous and troubling thing that I've ever reported. Yeah, hospitals completely locked down. Obviously, the families weren't allowed to go in and see their families who were dying of COVID. And there was one story in particular where I followed a team of Catholic priests for a little over 3 weeks in Boston. And we had approval from the diocese to follow the priests, but we had to get approval from various hospitals and then ultimately family members. And so the whole idea of this story was the Catholic Church has been around for a long time, like through plagues, through different various pandemics. And we felt it was important historically to say, how is the church responding to this right now, 2020? So I was the only one who was kind of in the field, and it was my job for 3 weeks to follow these priests and basically wait for people to die. And it put me in such an existential funk, because that's not the place that anyone should be in to tell a story. But we ended up talking to the majority of the families who couldn't be present in the hospital. And they were ultimately thankful that someone was there, that was being documented. And from what I know, that they were thankful for the reporting, they were thankful for the pictures. But I mean, almost 2 years later, that's something that I still wrestle with. And yeah, I don't even know really what to say about it, other than it is our job as journalists to kind of document the traumas and the horrors of the world. And when a pandemic kills almost 1 million people in the United States as of right now, it's our job to be there, but towing the line between what's important here as history, as news, as journalism, and then how do I tell these stories kind of ethically and responsibly, and also kind of protect myself too. I still don't know how to juggle all that. And I definitely don't have the answer.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you're talking about protecting yourself too, like, yes, we talked about safety, but also, moral injury and things like that, and really struggling with the trauma of exactly what you described, waiting for people to die so that the priest can deliver last rites. Like, that's a terrible position to be in. And absolutely figuring out how to manage that mentally, emotionally, spiritually for ourselves, I think is definitely an ethical consideration as well.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, the idea of moral injury is something that affects a lot of photographers who have to deal with trauma and traumatic events. But the nature of our job kind of forces us to say, okay, well, we'll put that in its nice, neat container, and then we'll move on to the next kind of horrendous thing that we need to cover. And that's the nature of this work. And, well, I don't want to say that's the nature of this work, but, as a freelancer, you're kind of forced to go from one assignment, one story to the next. And I realized that in 2020, I kept putting things in all these little boxes and just putting them away. I was giving a presentation to a university about my work over the course of 2020. And in the middle of that presentation to 150 people, it occurred to me that I hadn't processed 2020. And as a visual person, I was looking at these photos and sharing, and there's something incredibly intimate about sharing. It's not just looking at the work, it's sharing the work. It's sharing the experience of being there and having other, people kind of witness that. In the middle of it, I realized, something's happening to me. What's going on? And I ended up crying in the middle of this presentation because I realized that I did not work through this stuff because it was not out of desire, but out of necessity. I just needed to put all those things in the boxes and move on to the next thing because we were in a pandemic. It was in New York City. You had no time to think about your own moral injury. You had to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I really appreciate something that you said there, which I don't think I've really heard people say much before, because people will talk about how for photographers especially, they experience the trauma of being in the situation of photographing the thing. Then it can be quite re-traumatizing to then look back at the photographs, edit the photographs. But I feel like you just added another layer onto that that's super important, which is so being there, looking at the photographs, and then sharing the photographs with others.
Yeah.
And I think that that's such an important piece of that process that isn't really talked about.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's often framed that, we are the witnesses. Photojournalists and photographers, we are the witnesses to history. But I realized that it kind of flipped the script in the middle of this presentation where I was being witnessed kind of for the first time. Like my own moral injury, my own absorbed and secondary trauma was witnessed. And that shook me. That shook me to my core. But there was also something deeply cathartic about sharing that work with these group of people and having 150 people just be silent with you, because we're all kind of processing these visuals and this trauma in this shared space. And I felt like that was healing in its own right. So, for a witness to find themselves being witnessed, I think it can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. And I guess all these considerations in mind, I like to ask everybody, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Identifying your position of power, the position of power that you have with your camera, with the people who are being photographed. And that can be extrapolated to how are you extending power in the way that you edit? How are you extending your power in the way that you publish? It's not necessarily, again, just this kind of acute instance of when you're reporting and when you're in the scene. It's a much broader kind of patchwork of the way that you approach your work. And a camera is definitely a powerful tool. And with that, I think comes like an incredible responsibility to understand your position of power. Your positionality is something that we need to constantly bring to a scene, constantly bring to our stories, constantly bring to the people that we're photographing, is saying, here's why I am here. Here's why I feel your story is important. And here are the deficiencies of this way of producing work. Ultimately, I think it's about understanding of one's own position of power in that interpersonal dynamic between photographer and, I don't like the word subject, but photographer and the person, you're photographing, or communities you're photographing. And acknowledging it, not solving it. We can't, this is also a part of the conversation. I think so many people are trying just to solve these huge colonial issues that are baked into journalism, and we're not going to solve it. I don't think it rests with I'm Mexican, therefore I can only photograph Mexican stories. I don't think that that's the answer either. But I think that acknowledging positionality and acknowledging the kind of power that the camera yields is a step that we're currently in, but we just need to keep it going.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. Join me next week when we hear from Alex Reynolds on taking a step back. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics. This podcast was edited and digitally produced by Ellie Gascoigne.